In England on September 22, 1921, a patent was issued to a G. Benny. It had the following description: suspended vehicles. An aircraft is accommodated between a pair of rigid tracks by bogies and guide wheels. The vehicle may be reversible and may have lifting planes arranged longitudinally and adapted during travel to bear the weight of whole or part of the car. Separate propellers are provided, one being stopped and the other started to stop the car. This strange sounding vehicle described in the patent would be known as the Benny railplane. It was a form of rail transport that was both inspired, revolutionary, and perhaps a little too ahead of its time. The story of the railplane starts and ends with its creator, and the two are intertwined. To talk about one involves the other. The inventor of the Benny railplane was a certain George Benny, born in 1891 in Aldhouse, south of the River Clyde, in what is known as today a suburb of Glasgow. Benny, the son of an engineer, was always something of a dreamer and loved gadgets and machines growing up. He had a particular passion for trains, although, as the name of his invention suggests, it was an aeroplane technology that would make the railplane unique. Benny had decided by 1920 that trains would move more efficiently and faster if they were electrically powered and used propellers instead of steam from coal. Furthermore, he believed strongly that this train should ride above the ground, as to not be slowed down or hindered by other traffic. And so he commenced development of his plane on rails in 1921. However, there was a glitch in his ambition. Benny himself had no formal engineering training. And so he turned to a Mr. Hugh Fraser to be the consultant engineer on the project. Benny was convinced that his invention would free up room for freight traffic on Britain's increasingly congested railway system, which often resulted in delays for commuters. He also argued that his railplane would be less expensive to operate than conventional trains of the time. And he had some valid points regarding the cost. His railplane would be built and operate above existing train lines, so there would be no need for land to be purchased for his rail system. There would also be a cost benefit of freeing up existing rail infrastructure exclusively for freight rail, meaning commuter trains would run both quicker and with no delays. It really was a win-win all the way around in Benny's mind. Benny was fortunate enough to come from an affluent family and was able to invest the handsome sum of £150,000 of his own money, which today is a cool £9.8 million or $13.3 million US today. Benny's belief in his railplane was unwavering and furious, with massive media blitz to match. He even paid for a Pathé documentary that boasted all about his new invention, which is why today we have such excellent footage. His commitment was total. So what did the Benny railcar actually look like? It was cigar-shaped, reminiscent of a small submarine or a robotic underwater vessel. For its time, it was cutting-edge in design and could be described as elegant and streamlined, looking also somewhat like an airship gondola, a smaller, less blimp version of a Hindenburg. The mechanics of the rail car were fairly simple. It ran along the underside of an overhead monorail, very much like monorail seen at airports and amusement resorts today, and had two bogies with wheels, also known as trucks, which you'll remember were referred to in the patent, that were attached to the top rail so the rail car could be held securely in place. Wheels which rested on another rail would be suspended 16 feet above the ground. These wheels helped stabilize the train when in motion. Critically for its design, the rail car would be moved by propellers powered by onboard motors. The Benny railcar had two aircraft propellers, one on each end. The propellers could be reversed, and it was these two aircraft propellers that not only made the train unique in design concept, but also gave it its name, the railplane. The train also featured a braking system on the top that would hold the train steady at stations. The propellers were integral to the braking system as well, as the railplane would come to a halt when they were reversed. Each car or carriage was designed to carry a maximum of 48 people, although the first and only prototype had seating for far fewer. It was important to Benny that the train not only be a comfortable ride, but also luxurious, and so the interior of the prototype was fitted out by master furniture makers and interior decorators Waring and Gillow of London, featuring comfortable seats, stained windows, and plush curtains. But it would take all of his might to make this dream a reality. To create a prototype back in this era, it was rather a challenge for Benny. Parts for the Benny railplane prototype were built at the Darmore Works of William Beardmore and Company Limited in the village of... just pause the production here. There is no way I'm going to be able to pronounce the name of this place. I'm going to give it a go, but please don't hate me in the comments. Itchinnan in Renfrewshire, to the west of Glasgow. Beardmore and Company had been the manufacturers of the R-34 airship, which made sense since the railplane was heavily based on existing aircraft technology. A prototype comprising of an elevated track and a propeller-driven carriage suspended from a monorail was then built on a trial stretch of track. The test track was 130 yards or 119 metres in length along an existing railway in Mingrave, off the Glasgow and Mingrave Junction Railway, and located between Minnelgrave and Hillfoot stations. The development of the prototype at Mingrave took place between 1929 and 1930. George Benny's intent was always that his railplane be able to travel at speeds of up to 120 miles per hour or 193 kilometers per hour, astonishing railway speeds for that time. However, the test track at Minnelgrave was far too short for the prototype to even attain a smidgen of those phenomenal speeds. Nevertheless, Benny was convinced that his railplane could reach those maximum speeds, meaning that a trip between Glasgow and Edinburgh could be done in about 20 minutes flat. Even today, that trip takes right about 50 minutes by train. But why stop there? If the railplane had been deployed between London and Glasgow, it would have been able to do the trip in about 3.5 hours, which in itself is 2 hours faster than it takes by rail today, almost 100 years later. It seems for Benny that his idea actually worked, and the train of tomorrow was arriving at the station. The prototype Benny railcar at Minnelgrave was finally opened to the public on July 8, 1930. A test run would be done with journalists and guests on board. Although the prototype didn't exceed 50 miles or 80 kilometers per hour, the test was still heralded as a smashing success. The guests on board loved the experience. One journalist called it a wonderful product of British brains. People were enthused by how smooth and comfortable the railcar felt in motion thanks to its upper and lower tracks. Conventional trains at the time were anything but smooth and quiet. These trains were bumpy and loud, wheezing and shuddering as they trundled past. Not that pleasant. Here was a ride that was luxuriously smooth and oh so quiet. An invited guest on the test run had this to say: "The railplane operated with a perfect smoothness, and passengers only knew that the car was moving by gazing out of the window at the passing landscape. There was no bumping over rails, smoke, or whistles shrieking. A ride in the coach is sheer delight." Right away, the public started to imagine what it would be like to commute all around Britain this revolutionary new train. Imagine what that might have meant for a banker having to commute back and forth between Glasgow and Edinburgh every day. Some of those on board of the test run were almost certainly dreaming of commuter trips like that. Which can only mean that the Benny railcar was set for success. So if the railcar really was an absolute game changer, why was it never built? Behind the curtain, Benny had been struggling to obtain financial backing needed to properly and fully develop this revolutionary railcar. He was unable to secure the financing necessary to build that super line between Glasgow and Edinburgh, nor another proposed one between Southport and Blackpool in northwestern England. But there was some interest down in the south of the country. Several plans were drawn up for a London service, including a route from the city centre out to the new London airport, as well as a passenger line down to Brighton on the south coast of England. One of the London lines was even designed for a London to Paris commute. There were also plans for a line in the south of France. But none of these ever materialised. One investor, Henry Boot, proposed building 2 new towns at Waltham Abbey and Dangenham so that they could be linked to central London by the Burney railplane. That too idea ended up becoming nothing. So why was there never any interest? It should be noted here that the Burney railplane was technically sound and for all intents and purposes financially feasible. So why did the Burney railplane fail to raise the needed capital? A logical, educated guess would be that the rail transport authorities of the day were simply too scared of a popular railcar that would lose them passengers on commuter lines. In fact, Southern Railways made it quite clear that the company was not pleased with the idea of a potential loss of revenue due to having high-speed competitor transport passengers on top of its existing railway lines. This was made abundantly clear in October 1931 when Burney claimed that he had raised enough money to fund the 20-mile railway line from Holborn in central London down to Croydon Airport. Southern Railways refused access over their railway lines due to the potential loss of revenue from their own service to the airport. Ultimately, the railplane may have just been too viable for its own good. But our story doesn't actually stop here. There was a little bit of an interesting twist right by the end of our tale. By the mid-1930s, the British government was becoming very interested in the Burney railplane. Southern Railways had decided to relent and even offered Burney a stretch of a line from London Bridge to Dartford via Lewisham. But Burney refused the offer, standing by his wish to have the line to Croydon Airport instead. One can only imagine what might have been had Burney accepted the original offer of the line from London Bridge to Dartford. Unfortunately, this decision would turn things sour for Burney, and in 1936 he was ousted by the board of the Burney Railway Company, known as the Inter-Counties Limited. Burney was also declared bankrupt the following year in 1937, although this has been disputed by historians. Not to be outdone by being kicked out of his own company, Burney would persevere. He formed 2 new railway companies in 1946 and 1951 after the war, called the George Burney Airspeed Railway and the George Burney Airspeed Railway Iraq. It was during this time that Burney was also considering a proposed railcar between Baghdad and Damascus. That same proposal would balloon into a colossal monorail line between the River Nile and the Dead Sea in Egypt, which he believed could double as a passenger train and provide irrigation for the desert over which it glided. Imagine that. Unfortunately, these 2 ambitious plans were also never realised. Distraught, Burney would quit the railway business and go on to run a herbalist shop, the polar opposite of one would expect of a man who once dreamed of high-speed trains in the 1920s. Well, perhaps that makes sense for someone who came up with such outlandish, crazy ideas. As for the prototype sitting at Minigrave, it fell into disrepair and was eventually dismounted and sold for scrap in 1956. Burney would die 1 year later at a nursing home in Epsom, alone and allegedly penniless. John Messner, the curator of transport and technology at Riverside Museum in Glasgow, had this to say about Burney and his dream of a high-speed railcar. It never really left him. George Burney was clearly a tenacious dreamer and a man of vision. He was indeed a true son of Scotland, a country renowned for its inventors and innovators. Today, it's easy to look back and see that Burney was clearly right that the future of rail transport involved high-speed technology concepts. By taking the very best ideas from aircraft and applying it to trains, such as aerodynamics and electric engines, one could really see that the train of the future was already waiting with the aeroplane. I think that he would be happy to know today, looking down on the world, that many other countries have embraced this idea and created incredibly fast trains like those in Japan and across Europe. For Benny, that was his dream. And it's nice to see that for aviation and train fans alike, that there really was a synergy of technology between the two to bring one man's dream true. Thanks so much for taking the time today to watch this little strange video on what is supposed to be an aviation channel about a train that dreamed it could. One of those mysterious things from history that really required some type of explanation. And I'm glad that I had the opportunity here on the channel to bring to you this part of history. And I couldn't have done it by myself. Special thanks to my Patreons who have taken the time to subscribe to me to support me on this journey. If you'd like to become a Patreon, there is a link down in the description where you can jump on, talk to me directly, vote and suggest future topics, and see videos early where possible. So thank you again so much for watching. Adolf Hitler had a huge obsession with engineering projects that were, for the most part, bonkers. A mighty railway that would connect distant corners of the known world in an empire envisioned as the Great Third Reich, and change the way we travel. Pounding the steel rails from Lisbon to Moscow would be trains of staggering proportions, 6 meters wide with luxury apartments, cinemas, swimming pools, dog kennels, and of course 20mm anti-aircraft cannons, whisking passengers and troops away to far-off lands. Hitler's mega railway might have been called too ambitious by his own engineers, but was surprisingly closer to operation than you might think, even during World War II. So let's all jump aboard and ride the incredible and insane Reichsbahn. Nothing was too big in scale or too implausible in execution for what the Fuhrer dreamt up, whatever the scheme that caught his feverish fancy. For vast empire, you need a vast transport solution. The Reichsbahn, which translates the German as broad gauge railway, was one such mega infrastructure project. Epic is the first word that comes to mind when thinking of the immersive scale of what was to be a railway network that would crisscross Europe and beyond. Initial lines for the railway system were to be between the German cities of Hamburg, Berlin, Nuremberg, Munich, and Linz. Other, grander proposed routes were something of a lesson in European geography. For example, the east-west route would be between Rostov in Russia and Paris, and included stops in Kiev, Ukraine, and Krakow in Poland, as well as Berlin. Or take the north-southeast route, which would be between Hamburg and Istanbul, taking in major European capitals such as Vienna, Budapest, and Belgrade along the way. Other routes included those between Dresden in eastern Germany and Rome, and that between Munich and Madrid. Even more exotic routes that were touted early on in the project included far-flung destinations such as India and Vladivostok in Russia's Pacific Far East, with maybe even perhaps a direct route into Alaska, Canada, and beyond. One thing to note was that all these routes had one thing in common: the assumption that all destinations would be under the direct or proxy control of Nazi Germany. For such a radical rethink of European borders, it requires a radical rethink of train design. There were no less than 41 different designs for the locomotive offered by companies involved in the project. Classical steam locomotives, as well as gas turbine electric, diesel hydraulic, and electric locomotives were all considered, with power outputs ranging from 15,000 to 24,000 horsepower. It was finally decided that locomotives for passenger trains would be mainly electric and diesel hydraulic powered, whilst locomotives used to transport freight would be primarily conventional steam engined. High-performance locomotives would be needed for passenger trains so that they could haul 8-axle double-decker carriages that would have staggering measurements. They would be 42 meters long, 6 meters wide, and 7 meters high. The passenger carriages would have Dutch doors that featured retractable staircases. Luxurious facilities and unique features would be the hallmark of this train design. Proposed concepts would include carriages with large dining rooms, bars and lounges, as well as promenade and observation decks. Trains would further feature 196-seat cinemas, a barber shop, a sauna, and even a swimming pool, offering an array and type of facilities and luxury never seen before on any mass passenger train. The mail and baggage cars could transport up to 8 motor cars, and importantly for military convoys, include enough space for multiple 20mm anti-aircraft guns, ammunition storage, and gun crews. It was even envisioned that a large ship could be hauled by the freight locomotive. The overall dimensions and scale of the train were truly awe-inspiring. Its total length would be around about 500 meters with a capacity of 2,000 to 4,000 passengers. All of this would be achieved at impressive speeds up to 250 kilometers per hour or 150 miles per hour for my American friends. But to facilitate such a huge train, the tracks would need to be bigger still. In railways, the gauge size or spacing between rails is everything. The railway was originally proposed to run on 4,000mm track, although it would be ultimately designed as a 3,000mm broad gauge railway. That translated into a track with more than double the width of the common standard gauge track, so that's thick with 2 Cs. The project involved a ballasts track which consisted of 2 parallel pre-stressed concrete walls embedded into the ground, joined at the top by a flat transverse concrete slab. The flexible rails would be placed on top. Interestingly, Hitler himself believed that the standard Stephenson gauge was obsolete and too narrow for the development of a modern railway network for the Reich. To clarify, the measurement of 1.4mm was first used in the UK in 1825 by railroad pioneer George Stephenson and became the agreed engineering standard in railways across Europe, although some countries do have wider rails like Russia and Spain. There was also an ulterior motive for Hitler's insistence on a wider gauge. He wanted to ensure that the upgraded and expanded railways would be able to easily accommodate extensive convoys of military trains. This was a man hell-bent on waging war with the rest of Europe, don't forget. At the time of planning, Germany's railways had been badly affected by the brutal reparations bill that Germany had been saddled with as the losing aggressor at the conclusion of World War I, courtesy of the Treaty of Versailles. The Nazi-era Deutsche Reichsbahn, or German Railways, was therefore personally tasked by Hitler with improving and rapidly expanding the country's track network and rolling stock. Nazi construction engineer Fritz Todt is central to the story of the railway and the concept of a much wider network. Todt rose rapidly in the Nazi ranks and was the man who oversaw the building of the country's highway or Autobahn network. Hitler, ever the man obsessed with all things grandiose, enthusiastically embraced Todt's ideas regarding the wide-gauge railway system. But other railway experts in Germany were not so enthusiastic about the project. They thought a new gauge, incompatible as it was with existing rail infrastructure in Germany and abroad, board would be nothing but trouble. They also didn't see the need for such a vast railway system and proposed a less disruptive and compatible quadruple track standard gauge lines to be used instead. Hitler wasn't interested in their qualms, and what Hitler wanted, Hitler got. Hitler was even heard quibbing that Germany's rails being too wide didn't matter, since the rest of Europe was going to become of Germany anyway. And so, the project was greenlit. It would be an active project for the Nazis throughout World War II, comprising a staff complement of some 100 officials and 80 engineers, which, as you may know, was desperately needed by Germany for the war effort. So they had the trains, the track, the engineers were finally on board. Why did the project never leave the station? One cannot underestimate Hitler's obsession with the so-called Greater Germany, an expanded imperial Germany that would absorb all other European states conquered by the Nazis. The visions stated with the famous annexation of Austria in 1938 and ramped up with the invasion of Poland in 1939, the event that finally kicked off World War II. And it was this war that was quite obviously the demise of the project. Ultimately, like all other Nazi mega super duper projects, nothing came of this railway in the end. This was mostly because the Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, only lasted 12. Future Nick here. A quick but fascinating side note is that Hitler's visionary for this project, Fritz Todt, died in a plane crash in East Prussia in 1942. He had been arguing with Hitler that the German economy could not sustain a war with Moscow, and it was better to end it peacefully as soon as possible, much to the rage of the Führer. But conspiracy pundits have said that the timing suggests Todt was negotiating a peace treaty between Russia and Germany without Hitler's permission and was assassinated before he could rally government support. Albert Speer, Todt's successor, was due on the same flight and would have died in the crash, but was delayed boarding by none other than Hitler himself. Very curious. He attempted to look into the crash, but was stonewalled by the Air Ministry, who refused to investigate, stating the possibility of sabotage is ruled out. Further measures are therefore neither requisite nor intended. I'll let you in the comments think about that one for yourself. There is little doubt that Hitler was inspired by Russia and their Trans-Siberian Railway network, and there is some irony that it was Hitler's disastrous campaign to invade the Soviet Union that would mark the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. At least the Russians actually had their immense railway, which still operates to this very day. That's more than could be said for the Nazis and their doomed railway fever dream. You may think that this train is like any other, but it's one of the most deadliest weapons ever made. Carrying 3 ICBMs armed with 10 warheads each, this train alone could destroy the whole east or west coast in one go. And you have no idea where it is on the entire Soviet rail network. Why the Soviets built such a weapon and what was the story behind it is what we'll be talking about today, exploring the RT-23 Maladets missile, or known as the nuclear ghost train. In the 1960s, American high-altitude espionage missions had revealed the existence and precise locations of Soviet nuclear missiles. And this was a huge problem. With the missile silo locations being well known to the Americans, in the case of a first strike, there was a slim chance that they could destroy most, if not all, of the Soviet nukes before launch. With the Soviets surrounded by the US Navy, US bases, and its allies, a first strike by the Americans would almost utterly eliminate the USSR's nuclear arsenal, and in turn, any bargaining power that it might have had as a superpower. But Moscow did have one card yet to play: the sweeping huge territory of the entire Union. If there was a way to have a mobile platform to launch nuclear weapons, it would be like searching for a needle in a haystack for the Americans. This would eliminate their biggest threat and put the scales back in balance. And that's exactly what happened in the 1980s. Choo choo, because we're all getting on board the end of the world train. The sinister part about this train is that it would look like any other normal train. In total, there would be 17 rail cars that would comprise the combat rail-based missile complex when officially translated from Russian. The railcar composition would be as follows: 3 modified M62 locomotives, 3 launch wagons with 2 support ones each in a total of 9 rail cars, 1 diesel and lubricant wagon, and 4 rail cars to accommodate the crew. All these rail cars would be masked as either passenger or refrigerator cars, having this train look like any other normal civilian train. Just imagine trying to hunt down these trains. You would have to target almost any civil train in the whole USSR, and still not one guarantee that you would actually destroy the right one. The train would be able to cruise at an average 80 to 120 kilometers per hour, and the idea would be that it could move at least 1,000 kilometers per day in case of combat deployment. The train was also equipped to be able to short-circuit the power lines above and use this electricity if needed. Due to the size of the train and the supplies, it would be able to operate autonomously for up to 28 days, meaning that even if the command was lost, this train could still launch the missiles and assure mutual destruction in a nuclear war. This is some serious Metro 2033 vibes. At any time, at any place, the missiles could be launched in just 3 minutes from the moment they got a command from Moscow. This idea is actually very similar to the American idea of launching nuclear missiles from 747s in flight. But that's a video that you can watch after this one, as I've already covered it. The ingenious part about the Soviet missile train was not only that the train itself, but a new way of launching nuclear rockets. The Soviet nuclear launching train program began not with the trains themselves, but with a new way to launch the rockets. The Soviets were the first in the world to develop what was known as a cold launch rocket technology, which is radically different from the typical hot rocket launch that we know and love today. The difference between the cold and hot launch is that the main rocket engine is ignited immediately with the hot launch, hence the name, and with the cold launch, compressed gas is used to launch the rockets from the silo, or the container in this case, and then only then is the main engine ignited. Before the main engine, course correction boosters are also activated to make sure the rocket stays on course. The advantage of this system allows for much safer launches from the ship, submarine, or missile silo, and allows for reusing this silo after launch with almost no repairs. Nowadays, almost all ICBMs are cold launched, and some AA systems, like the Russian Tor, work on the same principle. The technology allows for launching an ICBM from, well, pretty much anywhere, and anywhere is exactly the advantage that the Soviets had. With the know-how and the plan in place, what happened next? The SDI, or Strategic Defense Initiative, also sometimes called the famous Star Wars program, was a program under Reagan to make the Soviet nuclear arms obsolete and give advantage to the US again, because in his words, mutually assured destruction was a suicide pact. The Soviet answered with 2 large projects of their own, Topol and Maladets, to move the nukes around the country and hide them from the American weapons. After all, you can't shoot down what you can't see. While the Tourneau is one of the best well-known missile platforms, it's actually the RT-23 that was developed into 3 variants, including the railway base that we're talking today. The other 2 versions were a silo-based version and a wheeled vehicle-based version, which was the MAZ-7907, but this idea was abandoned because of the complexity and costs, and also the fact that it couldn't fulfill all of the requirements set, so instead the engineers went for the other 2 variants to make sure they could come into service as quickly as possible. The missiles itself were to be developed by the legendary Yuzhnoye Bureau, which is now located in today's Ukraine. This is the same bureau behind the Zenit rockets and a couple other ICBMs, so they certainly had the competency for the task given. It's interesting to mention that they also requested additional funds to further develop the RT-23 into a carrier rocket for space-bound missions, but the request was denied, which is a huge shame because you can imagine a secret train launching rockets into space was entirely within our reality. But it seems for the Russians that it was all about the firepower. The trains of death entered service in the late 80s, with further ground-based silos being built, mostly in Ukraine. The lifespan of the missiles was around 15 years, and after the dissolution of the USSR, this was one of the first weapons to be included in the START treaties. All the silos in Ukraine were destroyed, and under the program, the RT-23 trains wouldn't be allowed to enter the railway network in peace times. By 2003, the Russians started to decommission the trains because of the missile's guaranteed lifespan was expiring, and by 2005 it was officially announced that the missile complex was officially retired. The Russians, however, started developing a new nuclear missile train called the Barguzin, which would feature the new Yas missile, being the main weapon of choice, but the project was frozen in 2017 due to a lack of funding. Or perhaps that's what they want us to think. And of course, don't think that I've forgotten that Uncle Sam also planned this trick up his sleeve. In the early 90s, Project Peacekeeper Rail Garrison was started to create the exact same nuclear missile program, just like the Russians, but the project was abandoned shortly afterwards. Or perhaps that's exactly what they want us to think. I hope you enjoyed this video, and do let me know if you'd like to see me cover the US attempt at this idea, so yeah, in case of nuclear apocalypse, don't catch this train. You might be the target. Brought to you by Squarespace. A train is rushing through the desert without a final destination, and it's carrying a deadly cargo. This train is unlike any other on the vast American rail network. On board, it has 2 nuclear missiles armed with 10 warheads each. This was to be the ultimate answer to the Soviets in the case of nuclear war. You've probably heard of the story about the Soviet RT-23 ghost train, but did you know that under Reagan, the United States developed the same thing? Join me today to explore the story of the Peacekeeper Rail Garrison. As satellites and spy planes evolved throughout the decades, there was simply no place to hide nuclear silos anymore, and this is why both the US and the Soviets were exploring the idea of mobile ground-based launch platforms during the height of the Cold War. With the development of MIRVs, or multiple independent targetable re-entry vehicles, or in simple terms, a ballistic missile with multiple nuclear warheads to hit multiple cities, only a couple of these rockets could create an insane amount of damage to the enemy. The only issue now was, where to hide them. To counter the US Strategic Defense Initiative, or the Star Wars program that claimed to be able to shoot down any nukes launched, the Soviets started early, and in 1987, their Ghost train carrying RT-23 Monorails missiles entered service. They had the upper hand against the Americans, but Reagan's administration was adamant to counter this threat and do it quick. Enter the Peacekeeper. It's amazing that when you think that the US military couldn't possibly re-weaponize trains again, they found a way with this nuclear train. An old idea, but with new technology to make it a game changer yet again. Just like how Squarespace is doing with websites. That's right, Squarespace is today's video sponsor, and it has plenty of great templates, or you can have a go building your own design with their powerful code-free builder. Plus, they have a plug-and-play e-commerce tech built into their websites to start selling right away, built-in email campaign marketing tools that are very easy to use, and their sites are already made for mobile phones. But that's not what's important. What is important is that when you click that link, you're actually supporting the channel and helping fund the animations and the videos that you love so much. So go to www.squarespace.com/found and get 10% off your first site and domain, as well as the warm fuzzy feeling that you're supporting the channel. This idea started forming back in the early 80s, but when finding out about the Soviet program, Reagan pushed this program forward into overdrive, and in December 1986, officially this new rail-based nuclear missile launch program begun. In summary, it would be 25 train compositions equipped with 50 nuclear missiles in total, spread all around the continental USA and perhaps even leaking into Canada, where they would perform patrols along the railway network and, in case of nuclear war, tasked with destroying whatever survived the first strike in the Soviet Union. They could pretty much be anywhere at any point, rolling along with other freight traffic, and they could even carry freight to keep up with the disguise. Each train would have 2 EMD GP42 locomotives, 2 cars with launchers and missiles, each holding 1 missile, a launch control car, a maintenance car, 1 with fuel, and of course 2 cars carrying the personnel to launch them. They would be equipped with enough resources to live aboard the train continuously up to a month, and all the cars were armored to provide some level of protection. And you know that they also had plenty of guns and ammunition on board to defend against any ground attacks. But let's stop for a second and talk about the armament that this apocalypse train would carry. In 1983, a new ballistic missile called the LGM-118 Peacekeeper had its first successful test, and this is where that Peacekeeper part of the train's name comes from. The MX missile, as it was also called, was capable of carrying 10 W-78 warheads, each 20 times stronger than the one that was dropped in Hiroshima, and it was designed specifically to be extremely accurate and easily retargetable if someone hit that city first. This is because the main task of these missiles would be counterattack, or targeting Soviet air bases, silos, and other locations where their nuclear bombs or missiles would be stored, so not specifically targeting any Russian cities. Combined with a mobile launch platform, this would ensure that the US military to have a last say in the case of a nuclear exchange with the Soviets, and allow for assured destruction of the Soviet nuclear arsenal before a possible invasion with other Allied forces. Peacekeeper was also the first US ICBM to use a cold launch system, something that we covered in our RT-23 video, which you should definitely check out right after this one. But to sum it up, a cold launch allows for the missile to be launched out of a tube with compressed gas, and then it would ignite its engines once it was already in the air. The main advantage of this was that it didn't have to have a specific launch platform, and you didn't need to worry about the rail cars being completely destroyed by a launch. It also allows for easier maintenance and reuse of the silos, or in this situation, the tubes and cars aboard the train. By 1986, the MX missile reached its operational capability and entered service the very next year. The missile was ready, the idea was sound, So where is our Thomas the Apocalypse engine today? 50 of the Peacekeeper missiles were placed in Minuteman silos across the country as a temporary basing before the train itself was ready. By 1989, following testing and modifications, 2 locomotives were transferred to the Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming, which was going to be the main garrison for the train. Apart from that one, 10 more air bases were constructed for the program, and it was projected that the whole system would enter service in around 2 years. So you know for a fact that this entire operation was well on its way to being completed, and all they needed to do was to pull the trigger. By 1990, the first launch car was also completed and started testing in Vandenberg Air Force Base. Moving on, and according to plan, in 1991, the Air Force sought an additional $2.16 billion for the purchase of the first 7 trains armed with MX missiles. But there was a huge but by this point. The whole point of these trains with these nukes was to target the Soviet Union in case of retaliation. But by 1991, the Soviet Union didn't exist. It was over. The war was won. The US military no longer needed such an apocalyptic weapon in order to target Russia. So they quietly shuttled the program, and the trains themselves were recycled back into the US freight system. But that's not the end of the story. Having all of this in mind, the Pentagon was quick to cut funding for this project and pour those sweet taxpayer dollars elsewhere. Boeing, Rockwell, and Westinghouse developed this project, were left without further funding, and the project was soon closed, and the launch car being transferred to a museum as early as 1994. The missiles, however, stayed in their silos, and with the START II being signed in 1993, banning the use of MIRVs, they were left without their true purpose. Even though START II expired in 2002, the US removed all Peacekeeper missiles from service back in 2005, and the only MIRV-capable ballistic missile in service today is the Minuteman III, which can only carry up to 3 warheads each. However, Russians did not only remove their missiles from service, they were developing new variants, with the latest being the Sarmat, capable of up to 15 warheads. Combined with their mobile launch platforms and the current climate in a geopolitical sense, this is definitely something to think about. Was stopping the Peacekeeper rail garrison the biggest mistake that the United States has ever done, and is now America relatively undefended from these new advancements in nuclear warheads? I certainly hope not. Let me know in your thoughts in the comments, and please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And there is a video about the Soviet counterpart, the RT-23 too, so feel free to check that out and tell me what you think is best. And if you really want to go wild, you should also check out the video about the US plan to launch nukes from 747s. So each plane would have multiple nuclear warheads on board as well, and be hidden amongst commercial traffic. Truly a nutty idea. See you in the next video. This train is unlike anything you have ever seen before. It never needs to stop, and it never needs to refuel. Why? Because it's nuclear powered. The atomic age promised a Jetsons world of limitless power, everything from airships to aircraft, and yes, even nuclear trains themselves. But railways across the globe never adopted nuclear trains, and our age of greener, non-stop service came to a sudden halt. All aboard Thomas the Nuclear Engine, the atomic locomotive X-12. The X-12 was 360 tons and impressively long, so long that it would have a pivot in the middle of the locomotive to go around corners. The engine bed would be comprised of 24 driving wheels grouped in 6-wheel trucks. There would be a driver cabin at the front, a reactor in the middle, and at the rear, the vast radiator array. But I'm getting ahead of myself. How would that all work, and what was inside? Starting from the front, we have the driver's cabin. There was an engineer who would control the train, and a fireman. Now I know what you're thinking. A fireman? He doesn't actually insert coal, but would be a nuclear engineer to help manage the reactor, which is definitely a slight step up from a man with a shovel. And speaking of reactor, behind them was the reactor compartment. The nuclear power source would have been a solution of fissionable material such as uranium-235, contained in a tank 3 feet long and a foot in diameter. This would, in turn, would have been enclosed within a 20-ton shield. It would be supported by trusses on either side to hold the heavy shielding in place with the core of the reactor in the middle. 10,000 liters of water would pass through the boiler, over the reactive rods, and then be turned into steam. This steam would then move into the turbine, which would be connected to 4 generators, which would power 600 horsepower traction motors to drive each axle. So yes, technically it was a steam train, but it was nuclear powered rather than coal powered. The steam would then enter a condenser and then be cooled by a vast radiation array that was at the end of the locomotive. This would blow air from the outside over the water lines before the now cold liquid water would be sent back to the reactor. The reactor itself would actually weigh 200 tons, with the majority of the weight going to the shielding. But we'll have a talk about that in a moment. But because of this radiation, presumably this train would have only been used for freight service and not passenger travel. And this was to do more with logistics. Passenger trains back in this era of America, which was more popular than air travel, had regular stops to load and unload passengers, giving them plenty of time to refuel. Cargo, on the other hand, would need to run overnight across the country, and cargo operators could save a fortune by never stopping, making limitless fuel very exciting indeed. This whole machine, whilst heavy, was compact and highly efficient for the time, able to reach up to about 9,000 to 12,000 horsepower when overloading the reactor. And to put that into perspective, the X-12 would be so powerful that it would be able to accelerate a 5,000 ton train from standing to 60 miles per hour in just 3.5 minutes. That's pretty damn fast. The engineers believed that this could push out the equivalent of diesel engines at the time, which is impressive that most of the power went to move the locomotive itself. The engineers figured it would cost around about $1.2 million to build the X-12, which was about twice the cost of a comparable 4-unit diesel locomotive in the 1950s. Believing that uranium-235 could be obtained for around about $9,000 a pound and run for a full year between refuelings, they thought that this locomotive would be able to compete successfully with diesel power under favourable circumstances. With the engineering problem solved and a pretty compelling business case, it was time to take this to the locomotive industry. But you can bet that it wasn't just the Americans working on this technology, but our favourite Cold War opponents, the Soviet Union. It goes without saying that the other side of the Iron Curtain heard about these developments and had to have their own attempt at nuclear-powered trains. At the time, the Soviet Union was massive, and creating wide-track trains with a large capacity was imperative in their large projects of conquering Siberia. In 1956, a publication in a Soviet magazine described the power of the atom was being used to conquer the cold and distant Far East. The Soviet atomic train would use a nuclear reactor to heat the water and a steam turbine to create electricity, which would then power the engines and the locomotive. Basically a very similar concept to the American one. However, they believed that liquid sodium was the optimal choice to be used as the coolant for the reactor, and they projected that their concept could generate around 5,500 horsepower, slightly less than the X-12. But this is where it gets interesting. The Soviet track gauge was already wider than the Europeans, but this atomic train would operate on a 2.5 to 3 times wider track because of the sheer size of the locomotives. All the passenger cars were also designed with 2 decks, and it would be able to carry an insane amount of cargo or construction materials towards Siberia, with ore, oil and gas in the other direction. Of course, the military applications of this train would also be very important as well, allowing the Soviet army to transfer huge amounts of personnel and vehicles over great distances very fast. The idea would linger for decades without any concrete development until the 1980s when Chernobyl put it on brakes. The Chernobyl disaster made it seem that a radioactive train would be a terrible idea, and the Soviet Union backed away from the concept. But surprisingly, all this nuclear innovation was from an unexpected other type of vehicle: submarines. In the 1950s, nuclear power opened the door for all sorts of atomic propulsion breakthroughs for the Navy. Everything was on the table, from aircraft carriers to merchant Navy vessels, but it was submarines that took the cake. Submarines, by their very nature, had to lurk beneath the waves and never stop moving. The Germans and the Japanese had learned this the hard way, that when a submarine had to refuel, it was at its most vulnerable. Thus, a power source that never needed to be refueled, or refueled incredibly rarely, was preferred. Submarines were also the perfect testbed for the technology. They were large machines that were surrounded by water, away from, well, everyone, a safe testing ground for nuclear reactors. Plus, the military, with their unlimited budget, was more than happy to experiment and get the fundamentals down, ready for civil applications like trains. Trains being large machines like submarines, operating mostly away from population centers, at least for the freighter goods variety of locomotive, and always required to stop and refuel, were the perfect subject for nuclear upgrades. So if submarines were so successful with nuclear energy, why didn't subjectively similar trains follow? We're over 8 minutes into the video and I haven't yet answered the question, why doesn't Thomas the Tank Engine enter the atomic age? Well, if the trains are going to turn water into steam using nuclear energy, then use that nuclear energy for electricity for propulsion, then why not use the existing electric trains and use nuclear power plants to provide them with electricity? The trains then themselves wouldn't need to carry the power plant around with them and be comparatively lighter. And let's drill down on that. While a nuclear engine would be the same as a steam engine, requiring fuel and water, it would also be much heavier and require shielding to protect the reactor, and in this case, 200 tons of it. That radiation shielding made it so heavy that half the horsepower would be needed just to move the train, and given the complexity of the engine, each would have a cost that was far more than the standard locomotive, so no railroad wanted to buy into it, especially in the case of derailment. In fact, in almost every scenario, nuclear trains were the inferior option. If you wanted to go fast, you didn't want to lug around a power supply and tons of water for your steam engine. You would just use an electric train like the Shinkansen or TGV. If you want to transport regular cargo or people on unelectrified tracks, then you could just use a diesel engine. You don't need water refueling stations along your way, and you've got plenty of horsepower to pull dozens of carriages. And if you want to carry large cargo across long distances, just use a ship or an aircraft. There isn't a railway network with a wide enough gauge because there isn't enough demand, because ships work fine and are far more fuel efficient. If you want to carry large cargo across a short distance, then just diesel electrical trains or tracked vehicles also suffice. Lastly, there's also the argument about giving nuclear technology to those who don't need it. The fewer organizations that have a good reason to have nuclear fuel, the fewer chances some of it disappearing and making its way to terrorists or minor countries that can jerry-rig it into a dirty bomb or engineer it into full nuclear weapons. You don't want your nuclear-powered train derailed by insurgents, leaking radioactive water all over the countryside, and then have 10,000 people get cancer from a dirty bomb, leaving the island of Sodor a nuclear wasteland. Oh, and remember that no refueling saving bonus? That's quickly gone when you figure out how much more maintenance and monitoring is necessary for a nuclear reactor to work versus a simple diesel engine. Not to mention the cost of a nuclear engineer versus a diesel mechanic. And yes, I'm talking about the fireman in this situation. So whatever happened when they took the X-12 to the railways? The project was developed by the University of Utah, and several different railway firms were initially interested, and General Motors was very keen in a bid to sell the parts for a prototype. Alas, the project never really evolved beyond the initial feasibility study, lacking the funding from the US government or any private ventures. In the end, the dream of an atomic choo-choo train never left the siding. Thanks for watching, and if you want to see more videos just like that, then make sure you click that subscribe button, because you don't want to miss out on all this cool content that we've got coming for this channel and into the future. And let me know if you have any other ideas of some wacky machinery or other things too that could have happened in our amazing. China and Japan have won the high-speed rail race. With bullet trains crisscrossing the Asian supercontinent, it has made the grandfather of rail, the United Kingdom, look as slow as the original rocket. Why does the UK not have bullet trains, and what is the future of high-speed rail in the British Isles? Way back in 1804, a British engineer by the name of Richard Trevithick built the first railway engine, but steam locomotion would not take off in a big way until 1829, when inspired engineer George Stephenson built the rocket. Great Britain would then become a powerhouse of locomotion engineering and build a rail network that would be the envy of the world. But things then started to slow down. Eventually, government reforms curtailed back the vast network of railways, and car companies came to dominate the landscape. With the inclusion of lorries and major highway systems across the island, the train was regulated to only high-capacity city-to-city routes, leaving many rural areas out of luck. So why did innovation stop in England? Why did they no longer invest in railways? And how did Japan and others come to dominate high-speed rail travel? There are 5 significant reasons why the UK doesn't have bullet trains or faster rail today. The first is that there are short distances between locations. About 80% of the UK's population lives in a minimal area between Manchester, Leeds, Bristol, and London. Spending a lot of money to go not very far more quickly is rather questionable. We are looking at saving under an hour for the longest routes and dramatically less time for cities already near London. Other European rivals who have high-speed rail, such as France, are already enormous countries, and the benefits would be instantly realized if they could cross them faster. The second reason is that the density of the population of the United Kingdom. Because of the first reason, it's pretty hard to lay out a new network amongst these cities, because unlike in France again, there isn't a huge amount of area in the United Kingdom that is empty between these major cities. The third reason is the historic hostility to investment in rail. Successive British governments have not followed up on the potential of high-speed rail, and plans have fallen to the wayside. Despite petitions and public support for faster trains, the government has been reluctant to invest in these vast projects. Our fourth reason is more interesting than you may first believe, and it's called path dependency. Essentially, Britain invented railways and pretty much filled out the country with them tout de suite. Once the rail networks were laid out with slower rail travel, you have all the disadvantages of being an early adopter. This means countries like Japan and especially China today can lay out high-speed rail for the first time with no other existing slow rail lines to compete, something that England cannot do. And the fifth and last reason is because of economic decline.
Partly because of the third reason, and partly a consequence of it, Britain has always struggled to raise sufficient capital in the post-war period for large nation-building projects, especially if, like Japan's high-speed rail network, needs to be consistently subsidised for decades to come. The result is that the UK has long-distance slow rail routes that are operating at near capacity. Experts have routinely said that a new north-south railway line should be built, and the government has finally moved on to that project with the proposed HS2 railway.
Britain's new high-speed railway, High Speed 2, is a game-changer for our rail network and will improve your journey, even if you don't use our trains.
The new high-speed trains will travel between London and Birmingham on 134 miles of dedicated track. They will pass through more than 30 miles of tunnels and over 10 miles of new viaducts, quickly delivering journeys on more trains with more seats. Phase 1 has a funding envelope of £45 billion and will open between 2029 and 2033. This new high-speed rail is set to reduce the time it takes to travel from London to Birmingham by 45 minutes, down from the current time of 82 minutes. From here, the network will extend north to connect to Manchester and beyond to the twin cities of Edinburgh and Glasgow. The whole route, once connected, you can travel from Scotland to London at a time of only 220 minutes, which is a saving of only 40 minutes. Other people have argued that the government should instead be investing in more modern or futuristic technologies, such as building a hyperloop or maglev technology. This would bring the travel time to cross the British Isles down to under half an hour. But honestly, it took England long enough to build a single high-speed train line. I think we might be pushing our luck. The United Kingdom may have started the rail race, but without serious investment for arguably little gain, its railways will only go as fast as the steam trains of yore, leaving the future of high-speed rail to the giants of the East. Hi there, it's Nick here from Found and Explained. I have more videos like this one on my channel, so if you like it, be sure to jump on and subscribe. I'm going to be trying to create new videos once a week, so stick around and let's see what we find. Let me know what you think of today's video down in the comments, and thanks for watching.
This train doesn't need tracks. With 56 wheels, this 570-foot long beast would be the longest land vehicle ever built, and it might even have been nuclear powered. This massive beast would be called the Tourneau TC497 Mark II. It would be able to transport around 150 tons to some of the most remote landlocked places in the world. It would have a cabin on board for 6 crew members with kitchen facilities and be able to carry an unlimited amount of cars. In fact, the engineers were so ambitious that they envisioned a future where this type of land train would be used throughout the world, from the savannah to the Sahara to even the most remote polar regions. But to understand why this train was built and its mysterious purpose, we need to go back to the very beginning. This story actually begins with a man with a plan, Robert Gilmore Letourneau. An adventurous youth leaving school at 14 saw him studying all sorts of trades including woodcutting, bricklaying, farmhanding, mining, and being a carpenter's labour before ending up with a sound engineering background working on car repairs. But the dream of working in automotive engineering and being a race car driver at night ended after a tumble, and he found himself in debt and needing money. So he went to work as a regrader contractor for the new American highway system. Seriously, this guy's early life is totally wild, and I'm not doing it justice. But it was at this point that he found himself enjoying the mechanical machines used in earthworks rather than the contracting work itself. By 1935, he devoted himself to the construction of unique earth-moving equipment, and business boomed. By the eve of World War II, he had multiple factories building custom machines in Illinois, Georgia, Mississippi, Texas, and New South Wales. Wait, that's right next to me here in Sydney. He was so influential that during World War II, he supplied up to around 70% of all the earthwork machines for the US Army, building a small fortune and also educating himself about the sheer order power of the US military-industrial complex. Sensing the winds of change, by 1953, Le Tourneau sold his earthworks division to the Westinghouse Company for $30 million, which is a staggering $318 million today. And why, might you ask? To devote his company, his newfound fortune, and his future to a revolution of both the figural and literal sense, the electric wheel drive. The engine diesel electric drive was a unique concept, but not entirely new. It was unlike any other drive train for land machines at the time, and by the early 1950s, a total game changer. While some machines had a generator on board that would send power to the wheels before, they generally used long complex axles internally to move the wheels. A famous example being the Antarctica snow cruiser, which, while it was impressive on paper, lacked the power requirements for its job, something that Le Tourneau most likely understood very well. So how was his design different? Le Tourneau's concept would put the drive inside of the wheels themselves, just like what we have today with many modern electric vehicles. There were also other advantages as well. They would require no brakes, no clutches, no transmission, and very few moving parts, just a cable from the generator to the wheels to power them. Plus, this would provide more power for his tractors and allow the creation of some truly awesome machines. Everything was under consideration for this new technology, from simple tractors to log-loading cranes, and some didn't even have wheels, like the star-wheeled crusher used to clear forests, to what looks like a prototype of a walking mech called the Tree Stomper. By the end of the year, he had created a whole range of wholesome and nutty custom machines, many of which he was ready to bring to the world. But the piece de resistance would be, of course, the Overland train. You see, when he sold his company to Westinghouse, he also gave up the rights to build any earth-moving equipment. This became a bit of a thorn in his side because he came up with some impressive creations like the side loader, which couldn't be sold because he was restricted. So these new machines would have to fit other niches, such as the forestry industry. For many years he had witnessed a clear lack of innovation with log transport, and he came up with what we know as the first model of the Overland train, called the VC-12 Turner train. This Overland train was remarkably simple, a tractor or locomotive at the front that would pull 3 20-ton carriages behind, every wheel featuring an electric wheel hub motor with the power coming from a diesel engine at the front. This would be eventually updated to 7 cars and proved itself with excellent mileage and a surprisingly great turning circle. Whilst it was being demonstrated to civil and military officials, no orders were ever forthcoming. But the army took notice and forwarded the concept to a special project, one that was going to protect all of North America from those pesky Soviets. The project was called the DEW Line, standing for Distant Early Warning Line, and it was a series of radar installations to warn of incoming bombers from the USSR. Initially, a first series of stations was built along the US-Canada border called the Pine Tree Line, and then a early warning system further north with the creative name the Mid-Canada Line. But thanks to better Soviet bomber capabilities, a truly insane radar line would need to be built, one north of the Arctic Circle, and be able to peer into Russia itself. But building such a string of facilities beyond the Arctic Circle, in some of the most brutal conditions in the world, would be ambitious to say the least. In addition to transporting the sensitive radar equipment and the 2,500 men to man them. Many of these sites could be reached by air and some of them by sea, but reaching some of the mountainous inland regions would be almost impossible. For Le Tourneau, however, he saw the almost and said, "You're telling me there's a chance." And he got to work on the second overland train, the Snow Freighter. Alaskan Freight Lines, who had the contract to construct the DEW Line inland, hired him to build the first practical overland train, the VC-22. The contract called for a single locomotive and 6 cars able to haul 150 tons, cross rivers up to 4 feet deep, cut through snow drifts, and operate at temperatures as low as -68 degrees Fahrenheit. A monster of a vehicle for one of the most harshest terrains in the world. The machine was built, and a year later, it got to work. Now, this is possibly one of the most fascinating stories of exploration and adventure that has ever been told, and me telling it can't do it justice. But my good friend Callum Ken, he has a great video on his channel all about this adventure and provided plenty of help for me to put this video together today. So I suggest you go check it out after this video. As for our story, we switch back to Le Tourneau, who was hard at work on his third version of the Overland train for his, and perhaps the world's biggest client, the US Army. Impressed with the performance of the Snow Freighter, the VC-22, and the Snow Buggy, a more insane looking snow vehicle, the US Army would go on to develop a combination craft that could perform the roles of both, with 2 prototypes of the Overland train designed for various uses. Notably, not just for the snow like the Snow Freighter, but for all environments such as the desert. In 1955, the US Army officially commissioned the Logistical Cargo Carrier, LCC-1, or as dubbed by Le Tourneau, the YS-1 Snow Train. Obviously the first in a very long series to come. And boy, was this thing long. At 173 feet and a maximum carrying capacity of 45 tons with 3 carriages, it was a monster. The lead tractor, or locomotive in a sense, was articulated into 2 compartments, with one holding the heated control room and a bunk room for 3 crew, and a rear compartment that had a 600 horsepower diesel engine with generators and fuel tanks. As the control car could move on its own, it also had a rear crane to be able to change the heavy wheels of each of the cars, a flaw that was overcome from the original DEW Line snow train. The Army would test this throughout 1956, and it proved its worth in both extreme cold climates and the rough desert of the American Southwest. It even went to Greenland, where it performed several cargo missions as well as extensive testing. Eventually, the Army deemed it satisfactory and decided to move onto Phase 2. And now we get to our hero of the story, and the one you have been waiting for. One of the biggest land vehicles ever made, the TC497 Overland Train Mark II. The Army was so impressed that they wanted to build an even bigger and more powerful overland train than the Mark I, one that could potentially have any length. To achieve the goal of an effectively infinitely long train, this version would have generator cars that would have self-contained generators on board to power its respective neighbor cars. Whereas the LCC-1 had a single 600 horsepower engine, the Overland Train Mark II had four 1,170 horsepower Saturn 10 MC engines from solar turbines, all powered by gas turbines spread across the length of the train, finally stepping away from diesel fuel. Because the power source was smaller and less room needed for fuel tanks, the cabin in the locomotive could be expanded to house 6 crew, and it would have a kitchen and lavatory as well. The interior was designed with moving surfaces in mind, and there would be slats on the tables to prevent spills, just like you would find on a ship. The actual control cabin itself was elevated to a height of 30 feet to give it better visibility. It was also high-tech too, with a radar on the top to help it move over terrain through poor conditions and to help with route pathfinding. The train also had programmable wheels. Each car wheel was able to be programmed by its respective brother further up the train. So if a wheel turned right to get around some trees, each wheel, when it reached that point, would also turn exactly the same. Genius. And also preventing the wheel arcing into obstacles and giving it the ability to perform practically right angles. In addition to upgrading the power source, it was also going to be primarily constructed of a new space-age material, aluminium, or aluminum as others might pronounce it. This would mean a lighter, more powerful train that could cross any terrain. An additional 2 power cars and 10 cargo cars were built for the prototype testing. In total, the train now stretched over 570 feet, securing the record of the longest land vehicle ever constructed. On flat ground, it could carry up to 150 tons of cargo at around about 20 miles per hour. Whilst the range at a full load was normally 350 to 400 miles, additional fuel trailers could easily be attached to it to extend its range effectively forever. The prototype was delivered to the Army in February 1962 for Project Otter for Overland Train Terrain Evaluation Research. It was tested extensively and passed with flying colours. But the team didn't stop work, drawing up future plans of a design of the Overland train to be nuclear powered, eliminating the range restrictions forever. For the Overland train, it looked like the future had arrived, all 54 wheels of it. So you're probably asking yourself, what happened? Overland trains had proven themselves on test missions and practical applications, and the 2 Army variants were ready to be deployed, but they never saw any action. With the Vietnam War heating up in a big way, the military wanted to redeploy its funding away from experimental civil concepts and to use it for more practical applications, like warfare in the jungle. The Overland train wasn't super practical in mountainous terrain nor the heavily forested landscape, and wouldn't be exactly useful in the new hot zone in Southeast Asia. There were some other niggling flaws with the design as well. Because all of these Overland trains were actually custom built for the requirements of the job, there was no such thing as spare parts or being able to swap materials between them. Every land train when deployed would need a full set of fabrication materials to be able to create any spare parts for emergency repairs. Whilst if you look at the standard US Army trucks, they were easy to repair and there was plenty of spare parts thanks to the sheer number of them. But it's more than just money, and it's more than just these flaws. It's the final reason why the Overland train was made irrelevant. Helicopters. Specifically, heavy lift helicopters had completed development, and they could match the heavy loads of the Overland train without actually having to deal with, all the problems that come with traversing land. Thus, Letourneau's Overland train's epic journey was over before it even began, and the future of us riding around in trackless trains would never leave the station. If you enjoyed this video, then I suggest you check out the other land train plane video that we have on the channel. That's right, a plane train built even earlier than this that would have changed travel completely. And a very special thank you to Callum and all of his friends who were able to help put this video together today. Thank you again so much for your support. And if you want to support the channel, then I have a really cheap Patreon which you can subscribe to see all sorts of behind the scenes goodies, vote on future topics, and help make Found and Explained a fantastic place to live. Thanks again so much for watching.
It's the year 1850 and it's the dawn of a new era. Steam engines are commonplace, cities are full of factories, and the world is in the full swing of the Industrial Revolution. And with it, the time has arrived for the water train. Known technically as a chain boat, this rivercraft was the first marriage between the almighty steam engine and the humble river barge. No longer would captains of industry be shackled by animal power or subservient to Neptune's command of the waterways. This incredible type of machine would put itself up and down waterways along a track, sometimes faster than the current, much like a locomotive that would come to dominate the land. But unlike land trains, in one fell swoop, the entire world of chain ships would vanish in only 50 years. An era so brief that many viewers watching right now may have never even heard of these craft. So in today's video, we ask ourselves, how do these machines actually work? How do they move around a bending river? What happened to them? And why will we never see water trains ever again? Imagine you're a coal baron and you need to get your precious fuel from the mines to the factories. How do you do it? In the early 19th century, trains that ran on land were rudimentary, slow, and were limited by where you could lay the track. And sometimes the distances involved would make the cost of a railway line to be eye-gouging. Shipping by water, however, was significantly cheaper. You could fill up a barge with a ton of coal and other resources, float the barge down the river with minimal effort, and not worry about the distances involved. However, the only way to get the barge back up the river would be by animal power, a series of noble steeds to pull it against the current. In some rivers in Europe, the current was so strong that rivers were impossible to navigate, and thus resources up in the hills were locked away. That would all change with the invention of the steam engine. By putting a steam engine onto the barge, it would move the source of power from the land to the craft itself and allow it to apply power against the raging current without having any on-land infrastructure. And the ingenuity of this design was how simple it was. The onboard steam engine would simply crawl itself along a chain that would run along the river's bed. Multiple barges could be tied together or operate on the same chain at the same time, and thus a water train was born. But let's get into the nitty-gritty of how this all worked. These boats, in particular the Bavarian chain boat that's on screen, were specially designed to optimize efficiency and maneuverability under challenging river conditions. Their hulls were symmetrically shaped, sitting almost level with the water at the bow and stern, which minimized the power required to lift the tow chain onto the bow and allowed for a reduced draught. The whole thing was very low. This design was particularly advantageous for navigating shallow rivers with fast currents, which were common across Europe during this era. Chain boats typically had a flat, shallow draught. When unladen, it could be as little as 40 to 50 centimeters, allowing them to operate even during the dry summer months when the river water was extremely low. But even fully laden with coal, the draught only increased slightly to about 70 to 75 centimeters. The deck of these boats was uniquely contoured unlike any other boat, low at the bow and the stern but higher in the center, which facilitated the installation and housing of the steam engine. These vessels varied in size to suit different river conditions, with shorter chain boats ranging from 30 to 40 meters in length to 5 to 6 meters in width were found to be more maneuverable, making them ideal for navigating narrow, winding rivers. The other hand, longer boats measuring up to 55 meters long and 10 meters wide were better suited for deeper rivers, where the deeper water required more power to lift the heavy towing chain. The construction of the chain boats involved either iron or wood, materials that could withstand minor impacts on the riverbed but were still light. Safety was a significant consideration, as the hulls were compartmentalized with several waterproof bulkheads, which helped prevent the boat from sinking in case of damage. Below deck, these boats were equipped with a steam engine, coal bunkers, and crew accommodations, ensuring that all essential operations could be managed on board. A defining feature of the chain boat navigation was the laying of the chain loose on the riverbed, which could extend for hundreds of kilometers. That's right, a single chain hundreds of kilometers along a river. This heavy chain, weighing around 15 kilograms per meter, relied on its own weight and the natural contours of the riverbed to anchor itself, providing the resistance necessary for the boats to haul themselves and their barges along, but also not get swept away by the river itself. This system was only anchored at both ends of the route, allowing continuous movement along the chain path totally impeded. However, the major challenge with this chain system was the tendency of the chain to straighten, pulling to the inner side of a river bend. To address this, the chain boats were equipped with large, powerful rudders at both the bow and stern, exceeding up to 4 meters in length, which were controlled from the deck. These rudders, combined with maneuverable booms that extended well beyond the deck, helped manage the direction and angle of the chain, preventing it from striking the rudders or drifting the entire boat off course. The booms also featured a chain interceptor, which would grab the chain if it would snap, preventing it from being lost in the river, which you can imagine would be very expensive to repair. And you're probably wondering to yourself, how would the chain actually snap? Well, that's because the engines on board these bad boys were seriously powerful. The first generation of chain ship had a chain driver. The chain would run over the wheels located on the side of the vessel, but this was a problem as it would list the ship sideways. Thus, for the next generation, the chain was always located in the middle of the vessel. The second generation employed a drum winch. The chain would be wound several times around 2 tractional drums in the center of the boat, giving the chain ship plenty of grip. However, this put a ton of pressure on the chain itself and would snap constantly. It wasn't the chain itself overloading on the vessel, but because it would wrap around the first drum more times than the rear drum, thanks to the increased friction. This imbalance would pull the drums tighter, but since they were so big and heavy and couldn't move, the force would echo along the chain and simply rip it to shreds. These constant chain breakages would lead to the third generation design, the chain grip wheel. The idea of this mechanism was to use just one drum or wheel for the actual drive and not to wrap the chain all the way around it several times, but to only wind it partially over the wheel on the top. The design would engage the chain securely without letting it slip. It would work with a different chain thickness and lengths of chain link, and it would also work independently of the chain's orientation, whether or not it came from the side of the boat or straight on. Even if there was a knot that had somehow formed in the chain, the design was able to respond without a problem. This third generation would be revolutionary and would be spread throughout Europe, taking the rivers by storm. The chain wasn't the only method of locomotion either, as the boat did need to disconnect to let other vehicles pass, or simply if it needed to get off the track for its own purposes. This was done by a pair of water turbine side-mounted thrusters. Water was sucked in through 2 rectangular intakes in the side of the chain steamer's hull, where it then flowed through the turbine inside. The turbine accelerated the water and forced it through the rear-facing outlets in the side of the hull. The outflow jets of water propelled the boat forwards, but it could also be reversed by just swinging around the reversing element, so the water was forced in the opposite direction. but the water in the turbine was always flowing the same. You could actually switch one side and keep the other one facing rearwards, and the boat could be turned around. So, what exactly happened? Why don't we have water trains today? Chainboat navigation marked a significant transformation in inland shipping during the Industrial Revolution, becoming very prevalent in the second half of the 19th century across Europe. This chain drive mechanism was particularly effective given the relatively low-powered steam engines that were available at the time. But the thing is that this design was not just a technical advancement, but also a practical response to the challenging conditions of river navigation prevalent then. Many rivers were either too shallow or too fast-flowing for paddle steamers to operate effectively. Consequently, chain boats became numerous throughout European rivers that suited this, but it wasn't that popular in America. But as the 20th century approached, chain boats face increased competition from more powerful paddle steamers, thanks to the advancements in steam engine technology, as well as the canalization of rivers, making navigation easier and far more efficient. The development of river systems and competition from road and rail further reduced the profitability of chain boat that were now seen as incredibly inflexible. This shift underscored a dramatic period in maritime technology where the innovations rapidly supplanted older methods, reflecting the relentless progress of industrial technology. In the end, the chain boats or the water trains were only used on particularly difficult sections of rivers until land trains could supplant them completely.
Screaming along a trench at 300 kilometers per hour is a unique bullet train design that actually looks like a bullet. With 110 passengers per carriage, this transport solution was cheaper to build than highways, thanks to a miracle material: concrete. And best of all, it was invented nearly 100 years ago. This train could have revolutionized railway travel throughout the last century and may have even eliminated the rise of passenger air travel. But it was never built. Meet the impossible Soviet concrete monorail. Russia is huge, and in the early 19th century it saw an explosion of railway lines crisscrossing the western populated region as the railway revolution enveloped the nation. And this place loves revolutions, believe me or not. Over 72,000 miles of railways were built, spanning from the border of Turkey to the North Pole by the time of the Russian Revolution. But as a piece de resistance, the Russians had always dreamed of a high-speed railway connecting the twin cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg, even as early as back as the turn of the 20th century. In 1910, the Putilov plant in St. Petersburg, say that 5 times fast, designed an impressive monorail that would seat 400 passengers in large carriages, with dining, bunks, bars, and more, with an impressive, for the time, top speed of 160 kilometers per hour. Unfortunately, political upheavals, wars, and a general lack of money saw the project shelved in 1922. But that wouldn't stop the Ruskies from dreaming up an even bigger, more impressive, and equally insane monorail project. And this one would be made of concrete. The principal design behind this new type of train was that of a slug or a snake as it slithered along the ground. It would travel along a 10-meter raised smooth concrete channel that would have no tracks or grooves, with its power supplied by 3 electric wires above. As the track itself couldn't act as an earth for the power, it would actually need 3 different wires. Each carriage would be 120 feet long and carry 110 passengers on board, with the passengers arranged side by side with the wheels in the middle. And I'll get to the wheels in a second. Thanks to the inertia and lack of track elements, the train would be quiet and ride softly as a cloud. The concrete train could go up to 190 miles per hour using the same amount of power as a standard low-speed train, and to slow down, the train would use flaps like those on aircraft wings today, dubbed air brakes. But the real insane secret of this train wasn't the track or its speed, but what was inside. Each carriage would have two large 12-foot gyroscopic wheels lined with rubber, located in the middle at each end of the carriage, with the same height of the train. As they were so heavy, they would act as inertia dampeners and in fact make the train move like a bicycle, eliminating rocking or even derailments once up to speed. This in turn would give it a low center of gravity, so they could easily go around corners without coming out of the trench, much like tilt trains that are in use today. The construction of the wheels themselves would be large, flat spheres like those on a skateboard or roller skates, and they would be hollow with a motor and gearbox inside of them occupying the lower half of the sphere. These motors would drive two small wheels that would run around on the inside of the spheres like a hamster, and the motors themselves would be on a floating spoke on one side attached to a suspension to eliminate any bumps on the concrete. They really thought of everything. With a motor in each wheel, separate carriages would have their own means of propulsion, making them more efficient and negating any max length of the train. Just like the land train that would come 30 years later that we have here on the channel. With the theory sound, it was time to build it. So what happened next? This idea was the brainchild of an engineer called M.I. Yamachuk. While electric monorails were not a new concept in the 1930s, he realized that most designs were needlessly complex and had all sorts of flaws and endlessly expensive. Instead, his concrete monorail, if you can call it that, would just be as cheap as a road to build, making the further expansion of Russia's railways across the continent exponential. With the initial idea in 1924, by 1929 he had enough cash to put together a small wooden prototype. It would run along a wooden track and have a dodgy power supply, but it was enough to get the attention of the People's Commissioner of Railways. Announcing that a prototype would be built from Moscow to Noginsk, our engineer hero was given 1 million rubles, which is 14 million US today, to develop a larger, rideable prototype. With a staff of 89 specialists at his command, from engineers to carpenters to even a plumber on the payroll, they built a 3-kilometer track with a small electrical substation. On this test track, they would have a 1/5 size model big enough to ride in, but looks rather comical when you notice the engineer's face sticking out. This test model managed to get up to 70 kilometers per hour, with those inside riding on a soft mattress lying down, with one tester remarking, "When I got into the narrow carriage, I was tormented by doubt. It seemed to me that the train in rapid should come off the tray and sure to turn over. Nothing of the sort happened. Gently rocking slightly without the usual clatter of iron wheels, the train swallowed space." With the test complete, the People's Commissariat revealed plans for a life-size 25-kilometer stretch of track, but the idea wasn't perfect, and this is why it was never built. Of course, with any found and explained video, we can have a bit of fun poking at the flaws of this design with nearly 100 years of hindsight. The first of these holes is in the front of the train. It's not entirely clear what they were designed to do, if they were windows for a driver, or air intakes for a future jet engine version, or perhaps a way to clear snow off the track. Also, we have to imagine just how easily this train would derail or be stopped by hazards if they were inside the trench. As it's a concrete tunnel, essentially, with the roof off, everything from snow to water to landslides could fill the hole almost daily and need to be scooped out or drained away. The other concern was the stability. They made a big claim that this train would be smoother than normal locomotives, but have you seen the testing footage? It doesn't seem to be exactly smooth at all, and that issue would only be exacerbated when it came to lower speeds or when it had to switch tracks. So what happened next?
While they were underway building the 25 kilometers of test track, concerns were raised that this was all folly and the idea was flawed, with one critical person noted as saying, "How much will it cost?" and conventional railways have not yet revealed all of its possibilities. You have to wonder if it was really about the cost or it was more about conventional railway barons at the time scared of this futuristic design, or others wondering if you should just build a road instead. In the end, it was cancelled and our hero faded into history with his invention only to become a YouTube video nearly 100 years later. If you like this video, then I suggest you check out the other insane locomotives from this era, such as the plane train right here on the channel. Or if you want to see something even more incredible, we have the land train that can go anywhere without tracks. Thanks for watching. This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Whatever happened to jet-powered trains? This is the fastest train to ever run in North America, and yet you can't go on it, and the record has never been broken. It used 2 engines from the mighty B-58 nuclear bomber. It ran from New York Grand Central Station, and it was built way back in 1966. That's 57 years ago. What on earth happened? How did America, the most powerful country in the world, fail to grab the future of high-speed rail that was right in front of them? And why jet-powered trains never took off? This is the express service not taken, the ultimate jet-powered rail car, the M497 Black Beetle. In the early 1960s, trains were dying. Thanks to the construction of the interstate system, Americans now could simply drive between cities much faster than going to a train station and riding around on a pre-war shabby wooden train. And at your destination, you also now had your car, so when cars looked like this, why wouldn't you? But it was the rise of jet aircraft that was a game changer. Gone was the typical propeller plane that was loud and uncomfortable, and now the new hotness was powerful aircraft that could fly nearly 600 miles per hour with jet engines. It was a game changer. So the vast rail monopoly saw the writing on the wall and realized that they would need to evolve or die. They pondered that if they could adopt the same aircraft model, having hub stations with high-speed trains between them, with passengers transferring then to slower local lines, they might as very well wrestle back their glory days. However, speed was the important factor, and the last time the land speed record was broken by a train in North America was in 1893. Yes, by a steam train, going 112 miles per hour. So needless to say, the railways of USA needed to innovate yesterday. Say that 5 times fast. Fortunately, one railway monopoly, New York Central Railroad, was on the ball and had a dedicated team of engineers looking at how to make trains better, safer, and faster. In 1963, a concept emerged from their team at their Development Tech Center, employing a jet engine to power the locomotive. They contemplated the possibility of integrating a Rolls-Royce Dart turboprop engine, originally from the Vickers Viscount aircraft, into an EMD-F unit. James J. Wright, the director of the tech center at the time, proposed the notion of experimenting with a pure jet engine to the head of the New York Central Railroad, Al Permon. But the idea was initially deferred as a silly overkill engineering fantasy. But the concept remained. Would a jet-powered train on an existing track actually work? Well, it seems like the engineers never gave up on the idea, and continued petitions got the director to change his mind. And a year later, he called them up and said, "If you can do it in 30 days, then you have yourself a deal." The green light was given, and the team got to work. There is one thing that you need to keep in mind, that these engineers back then had the balls to stick 2 jet engines on top of a train car and call it a day. Can you imagine if they had the power of the fluid engine on top of this, what else they could have accomplished?
Now, I'm not talking about some crazy Thomas the Tank Engine sentience, but rather the fluid engine from Squarespace, today's video sponsor. And hold your horses because I got a preview of the next video right here, and it's going to be a big one, so don't miss out. The Squarespace Fluid Engine allows you to take any of their thousands of templates, or even make your own, using drag and drop technology to make a completely custom responsive website. How responsive, you ask? Well, it can fit onto a mobile screen or be projected onto a movie theater without having to be redesigned. Not only does Squarespace have the ability to run marketing campaigns right on the platform to bring in more visitors, it can also run a whole online store with no extra coding. You just gotta add your products. In fact, it's what I use for my own brand of merch, foundandexplained.shop, for everything. Thanks, Squarespace. But now I have my own treat for you. For watching my little channel about trains, you can try Squarespace for free at www.squarespace.com/found. So not only do you get my gratitude for making all of this YouTube possible, but you also get a sick discount. Because of the absolute time crunch, the team decided to essentially take an existing railcar and slap some jet engines on top. Don't you just love the 1960s? The New York Central Railroad decided to use number M49716, a Budd RDC-3 that was 13 years old. This was a self-propelled diesel commuter car that sat 48 passengers in a 2x2 configuration across 12 rows, and featured both baggage and a railway post office compartment, known as a B-liner on the New York City Railroad. They transported it to the Collingwood Technical Center in Cleveland, where modifications were made, including detaching the drive shafts from the engines. After all, it wouldn't need to use its diesel motors to power itself. To accommodate a jet engine mounting structure, several passenger seats were removed. In the baggage compartment, over 50 instruments were installed to monitor speed, stress, bearing temperatures, and ride characteristics. And the post compartment was modified to house fabricated fuel tanks for the jet engines. The original wheels were then also replaced with ones that had cylindrical treads to give it enough grip on the track. And a small radio transmitter were attached to the front axles to send stress data back to the onboard recorders. But the upgrades didn't stop there. For the cockpit, air quotes, they managed to secure the pilot seat of a Boeing KC-97 Stratotanker. And whilst all of this technology may seem like cutting edge for 1966, the New York City Railroad had actually been employing similar technologies since the 1930s. They regularly used baggage cars filled to the brim with different testing technologies to monitor track and locomotive performances, so this was right up their alleyway. But now it was time for the jet engines. Somehow, and I can't figure out the story behind this, but the team managed to get two surplus J4719 turbojet engines from the Convair B-58 nuclear bomber program. This program was starting to scale back in 1966, hence the abundance of materials of the aircraft, and these apparently happened to be the cheapest engines that they could get their hands on. But where to put them? Initially, the head engineer of the project, Don Wetzel, flipped the engines and put them at the back of the railcar, but his wife looked at it and said it should be at the front. Ironically, this was not only more aesthetic, but it made the front of the train car heavier and prevented the nose from lifting off the track at speed. His wife would actually contribute far more than you might imagine during this initial development, with Ruth Wetzel sketching out the preliminary appearance and paint job, including the flaring at the front, and also help with the wind tunnel tests. The futuristic grey and silver look gave the media plenty of material to work with, and before you know it, the Black Beetle was born. Overall, the entire construction only cost around $30,000, which is around $330,000 today, so that's actually very cheap for a prototype product. Now that the jet-powered train was built, it was time to test it. Now, the whole point of this experiment was to prove that alternative locomotion, such as using jet engines, could work on existing track. And other test projects had failed thanks to delays in test track construction. Thus, the strip of New York Central Main Line between Butler, Indiana and Toledo, Ohio was chosen. It was 68 miles long, consisting of multiple lines, and fit the typical characteristics of their track of the time. The single M497 railcar was towed to its position, and on a warm, sunny morning of July 1966, it was powered up for its first solo run. But who would drive it? Well, it turns out that the perfect person was the chief designer, Don Wetzel. One of the main reasons why Don was chosen as the test engineer was in fact that he was a pilot and a locomotive engineer qualified in the operations of diesel engines, jet-powered aircraft, and even steam trains. Yes, he was actually also the last steam train engineer trained in the United States, so talk about the perfect man for the job. And a side note, the decal saying Pride of the Central was removed because the team feared that it referred to Don himself, not the train that they built. The first few tests of the train was moving around 50 miles per hour to test an all-important braking system. And that's where the first flaw was discovered. The heat from the jet engines passed over the radiators from the diesel engines, and while the diesel engines were not used for locomotion, they were used to power the air compressor brakes. So the jet-powered train couldn't slow down like a movie with Keanu Reeves. A quick snip of the emergency overheat cable and the problem was solved. Next, they needed a way to make sure the track was clear for faster runs, as it would be going fast enough that braking in time would be a problem. The team decided to employ a Beech D-18 to fly along the railway line and be a spotter aircraft. Ironically, during later tests, the train would start to go faster than the plane, under the conditions of the test at the time, and thus they needed to have a team member at every crossing along the whole test track, so talk about a high quality problem. On the second run of the day, it was decided to just go for it and put the pedal to the metal and see what this baby could do. Using all 10,000 pounds of thrust from the engines, the train managed to get up to a recorded speed of 183.68 miles per hour. Now, I say recorded because according to Don, it managed to get up to 196 miles per hour before the timing traps. Because of how light the train was, it actually failed to trigger the sensors multiple times, and the record is actually where it started to slow down after its top speed. This would be the train speed record for North America that's still held today. To put that in perspective, the Bright Line train in Florida has a top speed of 125 miles per hour, a far cry from the work done in 1966. So the whole plan worked, the engineers cheered, and the train was taken back to New York to much fanfare. New York Central issued a big public announcement that the future had arrived, and the public were invited to come and see it at the 60th Street Yard. The team then got down to business doing a case study for how this train would work, how much to charge for passengers, how it would work with scheduling, and how it would be the future of the railway. The point had been proven that jet engines on trains worked and the track didn't have to even be modified, and that a high-speed service could literally start tomorrow. So, what the hell happened? There were two major areas of concern. The first was the flaws of the prototype engine, and the second was the business case. Simply put, the M497 lacked any ability to go in reverse. The jet engines could hardly be turned around to point the other way when it got to a shunted yard, and not being able to move around like a typical train was a major design flaw. The team believed that they could add buckets to the engines like the Boeing 727 does for reverse, but that only doubles down on the next point, that the jet engines on the roof were much too high. The clearance of most of these lines, especially in the tunnels when you got to Manhattan, wouldn't allow the train to go many places at all, so the engines would now need to be integrated inside of the train. This in turn would remove space from the revenue generating passengers and cargo and create a major heating problem. Oh yes, whilst the heat was a huge major deal, the jet engine's exhaust was another whole factor entirely. Leaving a station, the jet wash would destroy any platform and burn any passengers standing there, and instead directing the heat upwards would just blow debris everywhere. And lastly, because of how much jet fuel cost, economically this would be a fuel-hungry beast and really not be that efficient at all, especially at the low speeds of under 300 miles per hour. But it was argued that all of this could be fixed with a proper bespoke built jet train. But the business case left a little bit more to be desired. The issue actually was speed. The train was too fast. It would overtake existing freight services and other passenger trains and require double the signal distance. It wasn't so much that the track itself was a problem, the tests proved that it was fine, but rather the distance of the signals would need to be upgraded. And believe it or not, these weren't the main reasons why the project was cancelled. It actually came down to a rival railroad. In 1968, only a year after all of this, the New York Central merged with Pennsylvania Railroad. The initial idea was to focus on high-speed travel between hubs, but was abandoned, and it wasn't exactly because of logic. Don himself, in the source of this video, said, "I wish the project had been received by Pennsylvania Railroad people as a true step forward rather than a matter to be derided. Unfortunately, it was another case of the NIH, not invented here, syndrome. The Pennsy people hadn't been consulted about the project and therefore they resented it. Unfortunately, the Pennsylvania personnel always had trouble with the Central's technical research group and their work. Moreover, the red team, green team's competition probably was one of the major reasons for the downfall of the Penn Central merger. To this day, there is still animosity between those that lived through the merger of those two railroads." As for the prototype, it was stripped back to a normal railcar and put to work until being scrapped in 1984. The jet engines were put onto a new train project to create a snow-blowing railcar, which was quite the beast. And you have to wonder, if you ever took a train from Grand Central to Albany from 1970 to 1977, you very well might have rode aboard the US record fastest train. Of course, this wasn't the only high-profile future train in the USA back then. There was also the GM Aero train. And trust me, we're just getting started, so make sure you subscribe if you want to see more videos just like this one. This video would have not been possible without the fantastic book written by Hank Morris and Don Wetzel himself. I want to thank these two pioneers for the excellent and incredible stories that they've put together for future generations, and I've put a link down below to check out their book. I wish more stories about crazy machines were so detailed. And a special thank to the Patreons who worked hard to make this video possible today and suggested it in the Patreon group. So if you want to suggest your own ideas, then come to Patreon with a link down in the description and send something my way. Thank you again so much for watching. I bet that most of you watching right now know this song better than you know monorails themselves. In fact, statistically, if you're in the United States, you have never been on one. There are only 16 monorail systems in the USA, such as Las Vegas, Disney World in Florida, Disneyland in California, Seattle, Miami Zoo, Jacksonville. Of course, they have a monorail.
Jacksonville, what up?
And a few others. This isn't including the various people movers found at airports like Newark and New York City. So why are monorails, once envisioned as the Jetsons' transport of the future using magical magnets, are not so present? And why have we got your grandma's boring old trains instead? I'm Nick from Found and Explained. Let's find out. Before we dive into today's video, be sure to give Old Maid Nick a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos just like this one. A monorail, by definition, is a train that uses a single track. Some monorail systems use magnets to levitate the monorail car off the rail, but many others use rubber tires to make contact with the track itself. Funnily, this latter design actually has more wheels than normal trains do,
requiring one to power the train and another two on either side to keep the car connected to the track. The United States saw its first monorail arrive on its shores for Disneyland back in 1959. Thanks, Mickey. So why would you ever want to build one? A monorail has several advantages over the typical duo railway line. Monorails actually have the least visual impact of all elevated rail options. With a single track, they can seemingly glide aloft those city streets down below and still let in plenty of sunlight compared to older overhead rail lines found in cities like Chicago and New York. Plus, less material is needed to make a monorail, and therefore it can be cheaper. The thinner track doesn't need so much steel, so of the choices, it's pretty affordable for cities. The monorail is also one of the most efficient systems in the world, hardly breaking down and able to maintain around a 99% uptime. It is also less expensive to operate than standard rail. This might have to do with many of the monorail systems being privately owned enterprises, subsidized by the tourist attractions they're affiliated with, rather than public government departments. Another advantage of monorails is that because they are generally on a single looping track with no crossovers or no other traffic on the line, they can actually operate without a driver or having to slow down, making them able to go between station to station quickly and efficiently. Alas, for as fresh and as cool as they are, monorails have some pretty steep disadvantages compared to the conventional two-rail transport systems, called duo rail in this context. Okay, we're going to get technical for a second here. In order to achieve stability, the rail in monorail tends to be both significantly wider and taller than you would think based solely on the name. Compared to regular duo rail, the loading gauge of the monorail cars is essentially the same, and thus there is not much of a massive benefit in slightly reducing the footprint of the railbed. The mass of the vehicles carrying the passengers, if the same as the two-wheel designs, will impact around about the same amount of force and will require the same amount of construction. This means that the same depth for the pylons and the same weight-bearing pillars. And bad news for suspended monorails. They require even more space to place their rail infrastructure. Plus, think about the level crossings in the movement at the ground and underground level. A monorail structure requires at least some elevation at all time, whilst duo rails can cross roads with less than a foot depth required. Despite appearances, when underground, a monorail still requires more superstructure than our friendly standard neighborhood duo rail. Again, suspended monorails are even worse in all three scenarios. Monorails also only make sense if the line is elevated nearly 100% off the track. But beyond that, there are very few transport corridors that make sense. Even at Disney World, they used the monorail to connect between different resorts, but when it came to its Hong Kong Disneyland park, they opted for duo rail due to the underground section and connection with existing rail lines. There is also the technical challenge of switching tracks. On a duo rail line system, because of the way the train sits on top of the tracks, they can crisscross over each other to let another train pass or to swap out engines. On a monorail, because the monorail cars wrap around the entire tracks, you can hardly use the same techniques. Crossover tracks for monorails are not impossible, they're just really slow and costly to build. Plus, it is yet another component that can break down. A small monorail network might not have the extensive switches, but if you want to scale up to a city-wide system, then the technology is limited. and we can't ignore the cost as well. With only a few firms building monorails in the world, they can really charge whatever they like for their proprietary technology, as opposed to open source rail infrastructure. So if monorails are so bad, why do some exist? Monorails got really popular around the middle of the last century, with the cities building the retrofuturism transport options to make a statement. But by the 1970s and 1980s, a monorail was seen as a failed and disappointing public transport system, and it was beaten out by cheaper alternatives, such as buses, trams, and existing trains. There were only a few places where a monorail made sense over other options, and they were built there more as a stunt than the actual public transport option, like at theme parks or tourist areas. In fact, in the last few years, cities around the world went out of their way to get rid of monorail programs. Sydney built a monorail for the 2000 Olympics, but it barely lasted 2 decades before being torn down. Today, the city is building an underground metro to replace it and integrates thoroughly to other rail systems. In summary, to answer the question of why did monorails not take off, and why did they never become the transport of the world of tomorrow? Monorails are a niche transport option, much more expensive than light rail or streetcars, much more visible than subways, much less flexible than buses, and much more difficult to engineer than duo rail-based systems. And while they are better than elevated trains in terms of blocking out the sky, they still block out the sky. But don't despair, plenty of monorails are still slowly being built around the world, today in China, Istanbul, and Malaysia, with the most extensive set to be completed in the next 5 years with over 40 kilometers of track.
China's BYD and Canada's Bombardier plan to add 295 miles of new track by the end of 2020. And to put that into perspective, since 1900 only 254 miles of track has even been built globally. That's more than double. Possible new projects include mass transit in China, worth around $450 billion in 300 different cities, and back home in Los Angeles, connecting the valley with the west side. Speaking to the media in 2017, LA Mayor Eric Garcetti said, "With a small footprint, with electric motors, safety for both earthquake and access, monorail could be on the table."
If you enjoyed this video, be sure to click that subscribe button to watch more found and explained stories. And if you've ever ridden a monorail, let me know down and bottom in the comments. Take care.
Transportation and Ticket Center, which includes Magic Kingdom car and bus parking. To the right is the Disney-created Seven Seas Lagoon. To the left is